On the third day of Operation Epic Fury, a United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle went down over Kuwait. Then a second, then a third. Not from Iranian missiles, not from IRGC drones, from Kuwait, a former U.S. ally, a government hosting American forces on its own soil, a country that had spent months privately warning Washington not to launch this operation at all. U.S. Central Command confirmed it. All 6 aircrew ejected safely. Kuwait acknowledged the incident. An investigation is underway. Now, before we explain how that happened, and we will explain exactly how it happened, there is a question that matters far more than the incident itself. Why were Kuwait's air defense systems operating at maximum activation, targeting anything that moved in their airspace at that exact moment? The answer to that question reveals a structural trap that nobody in mainstream coverage is talking about. And it is a trap that could reshape the entire architecture of American power projection in this region for the next decade. Stay with this. The Gulf Cooperation Council states Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates are not peripheral actors in this operation. They are the operational foundation. U.S. forces are staged out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Ali Al Salam in Kuwait, Al Dhafra in the UAE, the U.S. Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Every single one of these installations has been targeted by Iranian ballistic missiles and drones in the past 72 hours. Every single one has activated emergency protocols. Every single one is absorbing direct consequences from a decision that was made in Washington and Jerusalem. Here is where the picture starts to change. When Iran targets these bases, it is not primarily trying to destroy American military hardware. That is the surface layer. The deeper layer is this. Iran is applying direct institutional pressure on the host governments themselves. Because every missile that lands on Gulf territory, every intercepted drone falling on a residential district, every disrupted airport, and closed refinery, all of it generates a domestic political cost that these governments must absorb, alone, without the country that asked them to host this operation. Dubai International Airport, the 3rd busiest passenger hub on the planet, suspended operations. Amazon issued formal delay notices across its marketplaces in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE. Amazon's own data centers in the UAE and Bahrain experienced extended power outages. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery, one of the largest oil processing facilities on Earth, sustained debris impact from intercepted projectiles. Now here is the data point that stops most people cold. The Gulf states collectively hold approximately $3 trillion in sovereign wealth assets. These are not reserve funds sitting in a vault. They are active participants in global capital markets, equities, real estate, infrastructure investment, across every major financial center in the world. Their institutional managers operate on one foundational assumption. Gulf political stability is a structural constant, not a variable. A constant. That assumption is now being stress tested in real time. But that is not the real pressure point. The deeper constraint lies elsewhere. And to understand it properly, we need to go back. Not to last week, not to last year, but to the structural logic that built this entire arrangement in the first place. The Gulf Cooperation Council was established in 1981. Its founding logic was not primarily economic coordination. It was a collective security response to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq conflict that followed immediately after. From its first day, the GCC's strategic architecture rested on a single assumption, that a powerful external guarantor, the United States, would manage the regional balance of power, and in return, Gulf states would provide basing access, financial support, and diplomatic legitimacy for American presence in the region. This arrangement held for more than 4 decades, not because Gulf states were passive, it held because it was mutually calibrated. Washington managed escalation thresholds carefully enough that Gulf territory itself was never the primary battleground. The Gulf states provided irreplaceable strategic assets. America absorbed the strategic risk. That calibration has now shifted, fundamentally. The historical parallel that clarifies this is not a military one. It is the position of Western European governments during the intermediate-range missile crisis of the early 1980s. NATO allies, hosting American cruise missiles and Pershing Tutus, became the physical terrain of superpower deterrence signaling. They had endorsed the deployment in principle, but when Soviet missiles were retargeted toward their cities as a direct consequence, their domestic political environments fractured. Protests of historic scale emerged in West Germany, the Netherlands, Britain. Governments were forced to simultaneously affirm their alliance commitments and manage populations that did not want to absorb someone else as strategic competition on their own soil. The Gulf states, in March 2026, are in a structurally identical position. There is a second parallel, a sharper one. In 1990, when Iraq moved against Kuwait, the Gulf states aligned immediately and unambiguously with the U.S. SOM-led coalition. The reason was straightforward. They were the primary victims. American military action was the instrument of their relief. Their interests and Washington's interests were perfectly aligned. The current situation inverts that logic entirely. Gulf states are not the primary aggrieved parties here. They are collateral terrain in a conflict whose strategic objectives were defined in Washington and Jerusalem. They were consulted. They expressed reservations. The operation proceeded without their formal endorsement. That distinction carries an enormous amount of structural weight, and the signals from the past 72 hours make it impossible to ignore. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth held the administration's first formal briefing since the operation began. He stated clearly, "The mission is to eliminate Iran's missile program, target its naval capability, address its nuclear infrastructure." He was explicit. This is not a regime change operation. His precise words were, "This is not Iraq. This is not endless." 90 minutes later, Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the next phase of the operation will be even more punishing. 2 senior cabinet officials. The same day. Opposite signals. This is not confusion. This is not miscommunication. These statements are directed at entirely different audiences simultaneously. Hegseth's language is calibrated for Gulf state governments, and for a U.S. domestic audience that opposes an open-ended Middle Eastern military commitment by substantial margins. Rubio's language is calibrated for Iranian hardliners and the Israeli government, both of whom require continuous signals of escalatory commitment to maintain confidence in the operation. The problem is that Gulf state governments are watching both statements at the same time, and they are drawing their own conclusions. U.S. Central Command confirmed more than 1,000 targets engaged inside Iran across the first 72 hours. Iran's retaliatory response has been geographically broad by deliberate design. Confirmed strikes or attempted strikes across Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. A drone reached the U.S. Embassy compound in Riyadh, causing a limited fire. The U.S. Embassy in Kuwait was affected, with personnel placed on shelter-in-place protocols. Qatar, meanwhile, shot down 2 Iranian Su-24 aircraft that approached its airspace, the first nation in this conflict to shoot down an Iranian military jet. Now, back to Kuwait's air defense systems. When 3 American F-15s went down over Al-Jarrah, Kuwait's air defense networks were simultaneously tracking Iranian aircraft, Iranian ballistic missiles, and Iranian drones entering Kuwaiti airspace from multiple vectors. Their systems were operating at the outer edge of their processing capacity in an extraordinarily dense threat environment. The distinction between an allied fast mover and a hostile fast mover, at that tempo, at that saturation level, collapsed into a tragic operational error. But here is what that incident actually tells us about the structural situation. Kuwait did not want to be in this environment. Kuwait's air defense forces were not supposed to be managing simultaneous multi-vector threats from a regional power, while American jets flew combat missions over their territory. This was not the arrangement Kuwait signed up for. And the fact that their systems were pushed to the point of a friendly fire incident against the very aircraft they were theoretically supporting, that is a precise measurement of the institutional stress these governments are operating under. Let us now look at each major actor in this picture with that lens clearly in place. The United States enters this phase of the operation with 6 confirmed service members killed, 3 F-15 Strike Eagles lost to friendly fire, and a congressional opposition preparing a formal war powers resolution. The administration's economic vulnerability is not primarily energetic. Domestic production provides meaningful insulation from direct supply shocks. The vulnerability is inflationary. Higher energy costs feeding into consumer prices at a moment when the Federal Reserve is navigating a narrow corridor between growth support and price stability. The long-term strategic calculus reflects a genuine tension, a stated 4 to 5 week operational timeline against a reality in which no clearly defined political endpoint has been publicly articulated. Iran's Transitional Council is operating under simultaneous and contradictory institutional pressures. President Pezeshkian's faction represents a genuine preference for negotiated resolution, not from weakness, but from a recognition that Iran's economic structure cannot absorb prolonged conflict. The IRGC operates on a fundamentally different calculus. Its institutional survival and internal legitimacy depend entirely on demonstrating that Iranian military capability remains a credible deterrent. Senior IRGC-aligned figures have been explicit. Ali Larijani, whose influence over Iran's military response is direct, stated publicly there will be no negotiation under active bombardment. That internal fracture between political pragmatism and institutional resistance is the fault line that will determine Iran's next move more than any external pressure. China's exposure here is structural and immediate. Approximately half of China's total oil import volume originates in the Persian Gulf. Any sustained disruption to Hormuz transit does not threaten China in the abstract. It threatens the energy input of the manufacturing base that underpins its entire economic model. But here's the connection that almost no analysis is making. The United States military is currently bearing the fiscal and operational cost of attempting to restore safe passage on a maritime corridor that predominantly serves the energy requirements of its primary geopolitical competitor. The strategic cost-benefit of that dynamic is not favorable for Washington's long-term positioning in the Indo-Pacific. Russia requires almost no active effort for this conflict to be advantageous. Every week that Western strategic bandwidth is consumed by Middle Eastern operations is a week of reduced capacity directed toward Ukraine and the European theater. Every upward movement in global energy prices increases Russian hydrocarbon revenues proportionately, despite existing sanctions. Putin's formal condemnation of the operation costs nothing and builds diplomatic capital across the global south, where the sight of American military action against a sovereign state without explicit UN authorization is being watched with very careful attention. The European position is the most structurally exposed and the least reported. European states completed a painful multi-year transition away from Russian pipeline gas after 2022. That transition was built almost entirely on LNG imports, the majority of which flow through or originate in the Persian Gulf region. A sustained disruption does not threaten Europe abstractly. It threatens the literal energy security architecture that European governments have spent 3 years constructing. 7 NATO members have issued a joint statement expressing concern about the operation's impact on international peace and security. That is not symbolic language. That is a formal signal that alliance consensus is not unanimous, and that the economic consequences bearing down on European industrial economies are generating political pressure that will compound with every additional day of disruption. Now, here is the analytical reveal that reframes this entire situation. The standard framing of this conflict focuses on the Iran-U.S. Israel triangle. That framing misses what is already in motion structurally. Dubai has spent 30 years positioning itself as the primary financial, logistical, and professional services hub between Europe and Asia. That positioning is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate, sustained investment in institutional credibility, the credibility of a stable, predictable, rule-governed environment where multinational capital can operate with confidence. Every day Dubai airport is closed, every Iranian drone that falls on a residential district, every Amazon delay notice pushed to Gulf customers. Each of these is a signal to every institutional investor, every regional headquarters, every sovereign wealth fund allocation model that the stability premium embedded in Gulf assets requires fundamental reassessment. This connects directly to the monetary policy pressure that no one in mainstream coverage is discussing. Central banks are currently attempting a careful transition, maintaining rates at levels that manage residual inflation without triggering a growth contraction. An energy shock of meaningful duration introduces a secondary inflationary wave that is entirely supply-side in origin. Central banks cannot address supply-side inflation with monetary tools without simultaneously compressing demand, which means compressing growth. The Gulf disruption is not just an energy story, it is a monetary policy story. And every week it continues. The policy space available to the Federal Reserve and the ECB narrows, but the deepest structural consequence is this. The Gulf states are simultaneously the hosts of American military infrastructure, the targets of Iranian retaliation, the critical financing conduits through which any post-conflict reconstruction would need to flow, and the primary intermediaries between the Western financial system and the broader regional economy. If those governments, absorbing sustained domestic pressure from populations taking direct hits, begin to quietly reduce their operational cooperation, the logistical and financial architecture of this operation degrades in ways that no additional air power can compensate for. The friendly fire incident over Kuwait is not simply an operational error under investigation. It is a data point in a larger pattern. The compression of strategic space available to governments that were already operating at the outer limits of their political tolerance. Their air defense systems stretched to maximum capacity across multiple threat vectors, their civilian populations absorbing consequences they were not prepared for, their economic models sustaining damage that compounds with every passing day. The systemic consequence, the one that will outlast this immediate operational period by years, is the acceleration of Gulf state strategic autonomy, a shift already visible in the sovereign wealth fund community's positioning toward configurations that reduce dependence on any single external security guarantor. 3 scenarios frame what comes next. In the low probability scenario, Gulf state diplomatic intervention produces a pause in hostilities within 7 to 10 days. This would require Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE to jointly present a framework acceptable to both Washington and Tehran's transitional leadership, not the IRGC, which is not currently signaling any interest in restraint. For this to happen, the operational pressure on Gulf infrastructure would need to reach a threshold that forces Washington to prioritize alliance maintenance over operational continuity. The conditions for it exist. The political will is not yet visible. The medium probability scenario, The most likely equilibrium is a protracted operational period of 4 to 6 weeks, consistent with the timeline the administration has publicly referenced. In this scenario, Gulf states manage their exposure through careful public positioning, neither formally withdrawing support nor actively endorsing escalation. The economic costs accumulate steadily. Gulf sovereign wealth funds begin quiet reallocation. Insurance premiums for Gulf-based assets remain structurally elevated. Dubai and Abu Dhabi sustain moderate but meaningful reputational damage as stable operating environments. A negotiated framework of some kind eventually emerges, though its durability depends entirely on which faction within Iran's transitional structure ultimately prevails. In the high probability scenario, the path of least resistance if current trends persist, Gulf states progressively reduce their active operational cooperation, not through formal announcements, through gradual, quiet reduction of the logistical, intelligence, and basing flexibility that allows the operation to function at its current tempo. This does not end the operation, but it slows it, complicates it, and imposes costs that compound in ways its architects did not publicly account for. The Gulf states enter this conflict as hosts. They are exiting it, regardless of how or when this operational phase concludes, as something fundamentally more complicated. States whose strategic calculus has been permanently altered by the experience of absorbing consequences for a decision they advised against, which leaves the question that the next phase of this analysis must address directly. If the Gulf states emerge from this conflict with a permanently higher assessment of the cost of hosting American military infrastructure, and a permanently lower confidence in Washington's willingness to calibrate operations to protect their domestic stability, what does the map of U.S. power projection in the Middle East actually look like in 5 years? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the structural question that will define the next decade of regional order. And the answer is already beginning to form in sovereign wealth reallocation models, in quiet diplomatic repositioning, and in the behavior of air defense systems pushed past their limits over the desert outside Kuwait City.